What's going on YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and it's time for the playoff eliminator after week 8 of the college football season. We've eliminated a few more teams this week, and I think that the path to the playoff is pretty clear as far as who controls their own destiny and all of that stuff. So we're going to break down all of that in just a minute. But first, let's take a look at the teams that have been eliminated in the past. These are the teams that we've eliminated in weeks before now, and you can see this list has really grown. The majority of the teams are on this list, and we are going to have to potentially remove some of these lists. Again, I talked about this last week and have a new category, back from the dead, because there are some 2-loss teams that may have a case if there's a lot of chaos down at the end of the season. Like, take a look at Auburn. If they were to beat Georgia, Alabama, and then Georgia again in the SEC championship, you would have to look at a team like that as a serious contender. So we'll get to that if it comes down to that. But our new eliminations this week: Michigan, USC, Kentucky, and Virginia. Kentucky and Virginia were never a real contender, but until they got that second loss, they really weren't eliminated. USC and Michigan definitely disappointed. I know for both of those teams, they're disappointed that they're eliminated this early, but I don't really see either of those teams being able to get in there. Maybe Michigan. It's not likely, though. I mean, they would really have to do a lot here at the end of the season. Okay, so our top contenders. Okay, so I think the #1 spot is going to go to the SEC champion, Alabama or Georgia. These two teams control their own destiny for sure, and that's what we're talking about here, is teams that control their own destiny. So I think the winner of this, if these teams continue to win, whoever wins the SEC championship game would get the #1 overall seed in the playoffs. So both of these teams definitely still control their own destiny, and the loser of that SEC championship game may not be out of it. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so I think you're going to have the SEC undefeated champ if those teams go undefeated. Same story here for the Big Ten. I think Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan State, and Wisconsin, if they win out, I think all of these teams would be in the playoffs. Definitely Penn State. Obviously, they're still undefeated. Wisconsin, even though it's a weak schedule, if they go undefeated, they will get in. Michigan State is probably, in the worst shape out of these 4 teams. But I do think if they win out, I do think that they will get in. So I think these 4 teams, for the most part, control their own destiny. And then we go to the next spot here: Clemson, Miami, NC State, and Virginia Tech. I think all of these teams also control their own destiny if they win out, win the ACC championship. I do believe that they will be in the playoffs, especially, NC State's loss came early in the year. I think that helps them out a lot. Clemson had the injury to Kelly Bryant, so I don't think their loss is going to hurt them too much. So I do think, again, this is it. I think these teams control their own destiny. I'm not necessarily saying that I think this is how it's going to play out. This is just if they win the rest of their games, any of these teams would be in the playoffs. And then the last spot, we're going to give to TCU if they go undefeated, and I believe Oklahoma as well if they win out. I think that they are in. It may be close, but they've got that nice road win over Ohio State, non-conference win there for them. So I think that is what would propel them into the playoffs, especially if Iowa State continues to look like a pretty good team. So yeah, I think both of these teams control their own destiny, and I think all of these teams really do. But there is one situation where maybe some of these teams would not get in, and that is really about the Auburn and Georgia loser. If both of these teams go undefeated, the loser in the SEC championship will definitely have a case to get into the playoffs. I think next in line would be the loser of that game. If one of these other teams doesn't make it, say TCU loses a game, Oklahoma loses another game, I think they would be next in line. And the problem is that both of these teams, though, don't have that strong of a schedule because of how weak the SEC is, especially Georgia. But they have that game against Notre Dame. So I think there's enough of a schedule there for either of these teams really to get into the playoffs if they go undefeated in the regular season and then lose in the SEC championship game, especially if it's a close game. Notre Dame, I think, is next in line. You have to put them under Georgia. But they're a team that could potentially get in there over Michigan State. Even Michigan State is a Big Ten champion. Notre Dame might get in over them. So, again, those teams that I said control their own destiny, for the most part, they do. But, there are some certain scenarios that could potentially keep them out of the playoffs. But I don't think it's going to happen. I really feel like those teams in the first 4 categories we listed, I really feel like those teams control their own destiny, just because there's going to be some losses down the stretch. There's, all these teams are not going to win every game. It's just not going to happen. We're going to have upsets and things like that. So I think Penn State right now is just a little bit below Notre Dame. I mean, it is close. Notre Dame does play the tougher schedule. If you look at Penn, this is a 1-loss Penn State, by the way. This is not an undefeated Penn State. We talked about that earlier. But a 1-loss Penn State team, I should have clarified that. This page specifically is talking about a 1-loss Alabama, Georgia, 1-loss Notre Dame, 1-loss Penn State, 1-loss Oklahoma State, 1-loss Washington, 1-loss Washington State. So all these teams here in this category, we're saying that they would finish the season with 1 loss. Some of them already have 1 loss, some of them don't. So yeah, Penn State team with 1 loss. I think a 1-loss Notre Dame would get in ahead of them. It would be so close. It's hard for me really to even make that call because there's so many factors that go into it. Say Penn State loses a really close game to Ohio State, and maybe some of these teams Notre Dame has played, like USC, Michigan State, maybe they kind of fall off, and Notre Dame's resume doesn't look quite as good. So it's so early that it's impossible to judge that. But just based off of how the season has gone so far, I do think Notre Dame would have a slight edge over Penn State. Oklahoma State, I think, would be next. The problem with the Cowboys is that they didn't really play anybody in the non-conference. They took on Pitt, but Pitt just is terrible this year. It's not their fault. It's not Oklahoma State's fault. But that one is going to hurt them. So even if they win out, I don't know that they get in without a little bit of help. They could take that 4th spot though. But if it comes down to a 1-loss Oklahoma State team and a 1-loss Georgia team that lost in the SEC Championship to Alabama, that's going to go to Georgia. And then the final spot here would be Washington or Washington State. If one of those teams is able to finish the season undefeated, they have a chance to get in. Chances are some of these teams are going to lose, and they'd have a real good shot to get in. But as of right now, I do put them down at the bottom of this list just because both teams really didn't have much of a non-conference schedule, and then the Pac-12 is really down this year as well. Everybody's just beating up on everybody else. So I don't think that they're going to get in because I think just the way things are going to play out, I think a 1-loss Notre Dame might still be around, a 1-loss Penn State. Georgia maybe with just 1 loss. I think there's a lot of teams that may not be conference champions that would still get in over a Pac-12 champion in Washington or Washington State. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it all plays out. Again, I'm basing all this off of if the season ended today. I'm not going to project forward because a lot of things can change. A team's resume can change, in a hurry. Let's look at Notre Dame. Just talked about them a minute ago. Their best wins are Michigan State, USC. Let's say USC just really struggles down the stretch. They finish 7-5. Michigan State loses all these Big Ten games coming up. They go 8-4, something like that. Where's Notre Dame's big win going to come from? Let's say NC State loses to Clemson, and then they slip up and lose another game. Who else do they play? Miami. Let's say Miami loses Virginia Tech. It's possible that the resumes could change. Right now, Notre Dame's resume looks really good because they've got some really highly ranked opponents on their schedule, but that could change by the end of the season. And that's why, they put the playoff rankings out, but they have to start from scratch every single week. And then in that last weekend, once you take into account conference champions, which you can't do during the season, that's why things can change a lot that last week. And a lot of people don't understand it. They're like, why did this team fall off? Well, you just added a conference championship to this team's resume. This other team doesn't have that, and that was enough to separate a very close race for a spot or whatever. So this is how I think everything's going to play out the rest of the season. I do think it's very, very possible we get 2 Big Ten teams or 2 SEC teams into the playoffs. Clemson or Miami, I feel like is really has a great shot to get there out of the ACC. And I don't know, is TCU going to hang on and they're going to go undefeated? Is Oklahoma going to win out? That is yet to be seen. I feel like some teams are going to beat up on each other in the Big 12. I personally feel like the Big 12 is going to eliminate itself. But that may not happen. TCU may win out. I think an undefeated TCU team gets into the playoffs. It would be hard to keep them out, even over a Georgia team that loses in the SEC championship. I think you would still give that edge to TCU because the Big 12 is pretty good. They're going to have some solid wins there. A resume, pretty much as good as Georgia's, maybe even better as far as regular season goes. So I don't know. There's a lot of questions, and I think it's going to really sort itself out over the next few weeks. I think you're going to see more teams getting eliminated, and the path to the playoffs is going to be much more clear as we narrow this down. We talked about Michigan State on here. I think there's a good chance they lose to Northwestern Saturday, so they may be eliminated. Washington State, they're probably going to get. I mean, honestly, they're going to probably get eliminated. Ohio State and Penn State play this weekend. If Penn State wins that game, then Ohio State's out. So, again, it's going to be very clear, I think, after the next 2 weeks. You look at the next 2 weeks, there's a lot of big matchups, and I think after that, we're really going to know who maybe the 5 or 6 teams are that have a shot down the stretch to get into the playoffs, and it's going to be a very exciting finish to the college football season. But that's it for the playoff eliminator this week. We'll see if we have any more eliminations next week as this thing really starts to wind down. Maybe it's Michigan State. Maybe it's Ohio State like I just talked about. But we shall see. That's going to do it for this week's episode. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports YouTube channel.